He wasn't supposed to win. No one believed he could. But what happened next would shatter the expectations of an entire town. This is the story of a boy who, after facing the ultimate defeat, would rise to power in ways no one could have ever imagined. Prepare to be speechless. Ethan wasn't your typical success story. He wasn't born with privilege, nor did he have connections. In fact, he was just a regular 12-year-old boy from a small, forgotten town. His family struggled to make ends meet. His clothes were worn, his shoes barely held together. But none of that mattered to Ethan. What set him apart wasn't his circumstances. It was his relentless hunger for something more. He dreamed bigger than anyone could understand, and that made him different. The defining moment in his life came when the prestigious Meridian Scholarship announced a regional competition for top students. The scholarship promised a future beyond his wildest dreams, an elite education, mentorship from some of the best minds in the world, and the opportunity to leave behind everything that had ever held him back. For Ethan, this wasn't just a competition. It was his only chance to escape the cycle of poverty and mediocrity. He could feel it deep in his bones. This was his moment. The weeks leading up to the competition were filled with sleepless nights, grueling hours spent in the library, and long, lonely hours at his desk. Ethan studied harder than anyone. He wasn't the best student, but he knew his mind could catch up if he just put in the work. He memorized every detail about his chosen field, wrote speeches that would stir hearts, and practiced until his voice cracked from exhaustion. But on the day of the competition, something strange happened. The atmosphere in the auditorium was electric, charged with the energy of the best and brightest minds from around the region. Ethan stood among them, feeling his pulse quicken. This was it, the moment he'd worked for, the moment that would change everything. When it was finally his turn, he stepped onto the stage, heart racing. He'd rehearsed his speech 1,000 times, and yet, as he looked out at the judges, some of the wealthiest, most powerful people in the region, a wave of doubt washed over him. Would they see his passion, his potential, or would they dismiss him like everyone else had? He spoke. He poured everything into those words, his heart laid bare before the judges. He shared his dreams, his hunger to rise, to break free from the chains of his background. He spoke with such conviction, such raw emotion, that even the most hardened of judges seemed to soften. The room grew quiet, as if the air itself was holding its breath. But in the silence of that moment, something deep inside him stirred, a feeling he couldn't shake. This wasn't the end. Not for him. Not yet. Ethan wasn't the type to let defeat define him. He would rise, he would find another way, and this time, no one would stop him. The seed of defiance had been planted. Little did anyone know, this rejection was the beginning of something much bigger. But the question remained, how far would he go to prove them all wrong?
What happens when the world tells you no? Do you give up? Or do you use it as the fuel to ignite a fire that burns brighter than any of their expectations? Ethan's next steps would answer that question, and what came next would change everything. Ethan's rejection was supposed to break him. It should have shattered his confidence, silenced his dreams. But instead, it did something far more dangerous. It made him angry. And with that anger, a fire was lit, one that would push him harder, further, and faster than anyone had ever thought possible. In the days that followed, Ethan tried to act like it didn't bother him. He returned to his normal routine, helping his parents, keeping up with school, hiding the pain behind a mask. But inside, a storm was brewing. He couldn't stop thinking about the judges. He couldn't stop thinking about the boy who had been chosen over him, who had no more talent, no more drive, but had something Ethan didn't: connections. It wasn't just about the scholarship anymore. It was about justice. About proving that he wasn't just some poor kid waiting for the scraps of the world. Ethan dove into his studies with a fierce intensity. It wasn't enough to simply be good anymore. He needed to be better. Better than anyone. Better than the boys and girls who had grown up with silver spoons in their mouths. Better than the system that had already decided his fate before he had even spoken a word. And so he studied, not just books, but people. The successful entrepreneurs, the innovators who had risen from nothing. He devoured biographies, watched every documentary he could find, and took mental notes. But it wasn't just studying. Ethan was learning the art of resilience. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but if there was one thing he'd learned in his short life, it was that nothing worth having comes without sacrifice. And so he sacrificed everything: his sleep, his weekends, his social life, working endless hours at odd jobs to fund his education, to fund his future. But even as he worked, the resentment bubbled up. The anger wasn't something he could just bury. It demanded attention, demanded action. Ethan began plotting his next move, not to get revenge, but to get ahead. He had a burning need to prove his worth, not just to those who had dismissed him, but to himself. It was during one of his late-night shifts at a local coffee shop as he worked on a programming project that Ethan had an idea. It was simple at first, a thought that flickered through his tired mind, an app that could help people in his community, people like him, manage their finances. Something that would empower them, a way out of the poverty that chained them. The idea caught fire in his mind. It wasn't just an app, it was his ticket to a new life. If he could build it, if he could make it work, it could change everything. He started sketching out designs on napkins and scraps of paper, refining the concept as the nights grew longer. But this wasn't just about the idea itself, it was about proof. Proof that he had something to offer, something that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. The more Ethan worked, the clearer it became. The scholarship was just the beginning of his journey. This app, this idea, was going to be his true revolution. It wasn't just about financial freedom, it was about freedom itself. Freedom from the system that had told him he wasn't enough, freedom from the people who had closed the door on him. But there was one problem. Ethan didn't have the resources or experience to build something of this scale. He had the idea, the passion, but he needed more. And so he turned to the only place left where he could find help: his peers. He needed a team, people who could see his vision, people who believed in him, even if no one else did. He found Josh, a fellow student who had a knack for coding and a similar drive for success. Josh, who had once been a friend, seemed like the perfect partner. Together, they started building the prototype for the app. But as the days turned into weeks, Ethan began to notice something unsettling. Josh was pulling away, becoming more distant, less involved. There were whispers of another project that Josh was working on, a project that seemed suspiciously similar to Ethan's. But Ethan, in his blind drive for success, ignored the warning signs. Then, one evening, it happened. Ethan logged into the cloud storage where they had saved their work, and it was all gone. The app, the code, everything. Josh had stolen it. He had sold the idea to a rival company, cutting Ethan out completely. For the second time in his life, Ethan felt the crushing weight of betrayal. He had trusted Josh, believed in him, and in return, he was left with nothing. It was worse than the scholarship rejection. This wasn't just about losing an opportunity. This was about losing a part of himself. But this time, something was different. Ethan wasn't going to give up. He wasn't going to let this defeat define him. No more. He took a deep breath, gathered the pieces of his broken dream, and started over. Would he be able to rise again from the ashes of his second defeat? 2 defeats. 2 betrayals. But in the deepest shadows, something incredible was brewing. Ethan wasn't just going to pick up the pieces of his broken dream. He was going to forge something stronger, something unbreakable. His rise was just beginning, and the world had no idea what was coming. Ethan sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the empty screen before him. His heart was still racing from the discovery that Josh had stolen his idea, sold it to a rival company, and left him with nothing. Everything he had worked for, his dream, his future, was gone. The pain was so sharp it felt like a physical wound, a deep, aching cut that wouldn't stop bleeding. But as he sat there in the dark, the anger started to shift. At first, it had been pure rage, fury at Josh for betraying him, fury at the world for always holding him down. But as the seconds turned into minutes, and the minutes into hours, something else began to rise within him. A quiet, determined resolve. He wasn't going to let this define him. Not again. Ethan had been knocked down twice now, but he would get back up. He had no choice. His future wasn't in anyone's hands but his own. He wasn't going to let Josh or anyone else steal that from him. The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights, long hours spent in front of a computer screen, and a growing sense of purpose. Ethan knew he was starting from scratch, again, but this time, he was ready. He wasn't just rebuilding an app. He was rebuilding his entire life. This time, he wasn't going to trust anyone but himself. He dug deep, using every ounce of knowledge he had gained over the last year, the skills he had learned from books, from watching others, from his mistakes. And just when it seemed like he was starting to hit a wall, something unexpected happened. He had a breakthrough. It wasn't a new idea. It was an improved version of the old one that combined everything he had learned from his setbacks. Ethan spent days perfecting the new concept, refining it with the precision of a craftsman. He poured his heart and soul into this new version of the app, not just to make money or to prove others wrong, but to prove something to himself, that nothing, not even betrayal, could stop him. As the app slowly came to life, Ethan felt the excitement bubbling up again. It was different this time. It wasn't just another project. This was personal. This app was going to be more than just a financial tool for people in need. It was going to be his comeback. It was going to be his declaration that nothing could hold him back. But as the app started to take shape, the pressure mounted. Ethan's days were a blur of coding, testing, and designing. He barely slept, barely ate. The weight of the task before him was overwhelming. He had no investors, no partners, no team. It was just him, alone in a small, cramped apartment, trying to build something that would change his life. And then, just as it seemed like the app was finally coming together, disaster struck again. Ethan's hard drive crashed. All his work, everything was gone. Years of effort, gone in an instant. His hands trembled as he stared at the blank screen, his heart sinking into his stomach. This couldn't be happening again. But this time, something inside him clicked. He wasn't going to give up. He wasn't going to break. He had come too far. He had fought too hard. With a steady breath, Ethan pulled himself together and began again. He didn't let the crash stop him. He rebuilt the app, this time with even more passion, more fire than before. It took weeks, but soon the app was finally ready. Ethan had created something new, something revolutionary. An intuitive financial tool designed to help people like him, people who had been left behind by the system, manage their money and find a way out of poverty. But the app wasn't just a product, it was the embodiment of his journey. Every setback, every failure, every betrayal had led him here, to this moment. Ethan knew he had something special, but there was still one thing missing. The launch. It had to be perfect. This was his chance to prove that no defeat could break him. This was his chance to show the world what he was capable of. With trembling hands, he pressed the launch button. The app went live. And just like that, the world changed. Ethan's app caught the attention of the right people. The kind of people who could see the potential in a young man who had risen from the ashes. Investors, tech blogs, and social media influencers began to take notice. It wasn't just another app. It was a story. Ethan's story. The underdog who had fought his way back from two crushing defeats, from betrayal, from failure. He didn't just make it, he made it big. And as the media buzzed with his success, the world began to see Ethan for what he truly was. A force to be reckoned with. But there was one question Ethan had to ask himself. Was this really the victory he had been fighting for all along? Or was there something deeper, something more, that he had yet to discover about his true power? Success is a double-edged sword. Ethan had risen from the ashes of his failures, but now that he was on top, he was about to discover just how steep the price of victory could be. The harder you fight to stay at the top, the more it costs. And sometimes the real battle begins once you win. Ethan had done it. His app was a success, beyond anything he could have imagined. Investors were throwing money at him. Tech blogs hailed him as the next big thing. People were using his app, and his vision had turned into a thriving business. But the moment the app launched, the world shifted. Ethan was no longer just a small-town dreamer. He was now a player in the big leagues. And with that shift came a new set of challenges, ones that no one had warned him about. At first, the success was intoxicating. He had always dreamed of this kind of recognition, of proving that his hard work, his sacrifice, had paid off. Every day seemed like a new victory. Investors lined up for meetings. eager to discuss how they could help expand his app to global markets. People he had once admired were now seeking his advice. For a brief moment, Ethan felt on top of the world. He had made it. No one could touch him now. But as the days passed, cracks began to appear in his perfect facade. The first sign of trouble came when one of his major investors, a powerful tech mogul named Richard Hawke, pushed him to take his app in a new direction. One that felt wrong to Ethan. Hawke wanted to monetize the app in ways that would make it less accessible to the people it was originally intended to help. He wanted to partner with corporations that would change the core values of the product. Ethan hesitated. The app was his baby, his creation. It was everything he had fought for, everything he had believed in. And yet, here was the reality of the business world. Success came at a price. The more investors wanted, the more control they expected. Ethan was faced with a decision that felt like a betrayal to everything he stood for. Should he sacrifice the app's original purpose to make more money and expand quickly? Or should he risk it all, standing firm in his vision, knowing that the competition was fierce and ruthless? The pressure began to mount. Every decision felt like it carried the weight of the world. Ethan couldn't sleep. His stomach churned every time he opened his email, seeing another message from Richard, another demand. His once optimistic dream was starting to feel like a prison. To make matters worse, Ethan's personal life began to unravel. The friends he had once counted on, the people who had supported him through the darkest days, started to pull away. They didn't understand the new Ethan, the successful entrepreneur with investors breathing down his neck with no time for anything but work. His old friends, the ones who had been there before the fame, began to drift away. His family was concerned, but they didn't know what to do. The loneliness that came with his success was suffocating. Ethan had no one left who truly understood what he was going through. He had achieved everything he had ever wanted, but in the process he had lost more than he could have imagined. And then, the most unexpected blow came. Ethan found out that his former best friend, Josh, had been trying to buy up shares of his company, using the same connections he had once betrayed Ethan with. Josh was making moves behind the scenes, trying to turn the company into something he could control. It was a gut punch, another betrayal from the person who had once been his closest ally. Ethan felt the walls closing in. The business was growing, but it was no longer the dream he had envisioned. It was a machine, a cold, calculating force, and Ethan was losing control. The pressure, the constant negotiations, the late nights, it was all starting to take a toll on him. His health began to deteriorate. He couldn't focus. He couldn't sleep. The man who had fought to rise from the ashes of his failures now found himself trapped in a world he no longer recognized. Success had come at a cost, and Ethan wasn't sure it was worth it. He had fought for freedom, for control over his own life, but now he felt more trapped than ever. The fight he had won seemed like a distant memory, replaced by endless meetings, demands, and the constant fear of losing it all. In the midst of his growing despair, Ethan received a message from someone who had once been a mentor to him, a former professor from his community college who had always believed in him. The message was simple, yet it hit Ethan like a ton of bricks. Success isn't measured by what you've built, Ethan. It's measured by what you've held on to. The words lingered in his mind, haunting him in his sleepless nights. What had he held on to through this entire journey? Was it the dream, or was it something more? And so Ethan found himself standing at a crossroads once again. The choice before him was clear. Continue down the path he was on, sacrificing his values and his peace of mind for more success, or walk away from the deal with Richard, from the world of business he had stepped into, and reclaim the vision that had fueled his rise. But was he too deep in the game to back out now? Was it possible to regain control of his destiny? The hardest battles are not fought in boardrooms or in the glare of public scrutiny. They are fought in the heart. Ethan had risen to the top, but now he had to face the hardest decision of all. Who was he really fighting for? The world or himself? Ethan stood at the edge, his mind racing. The world he had built, the empire he had fought for, was now a gilded cage. He had everything he'd ever wanted. The success, the fame, the investors, the app that was revolutionizing lives. And yet, it all felt meaningless. The hollow echo of his achievements reverberated in his chest. He had climbed the ladder, but in doing so, he had lost the very thing that had made him rise in the first place: his integrity, his purpose, his soul. The message from his old professor echoed in his mind. Success isn't measured by what you've built, Ethan. It's measured by what you've held on to. It was a wake-up call. Ethan had built a career, a fortune, but at what cost? He had sacrificed his peace, his friendships, and his original vision. He had given everything to the system that had once rejected him, and now the system was demanding more. He had become a cog in the very machine he had once dreamed of dismantling. Ethan's phone buzzed. Another email from Richard Hawk demanding more control over the company. Another message from Josh, offering to buy a larger stake in the business. Ethan realized that his success wasn't the triumph he had imagined. It was a constant battle to maintain his place at the top. The price of power was more than he was willing to pay. He thought about the people he had wanted to help, the ones who had inspired his app in the first place. The dream he had fought for was now being twisted into something unrecognizable. His app, once a tool for financial freedom, was now a machine for profit, an app that pushed products and services that didn't align with the mission he had set out to accomplish. In a moment of clarity, Ethan realized that he had to make a choice that would change everything. He called a meeting with Richard, with Josh, with all the investors who had poured money into his vision. When they arrived, he stood before them, his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time, he wasn't afraid. For the first time, he knew exactly what needed to be done. "I'm walking away," he said, his voice steady. "I'm pulling out of the deal. I'm taking back control of my app, my company, and my vision. I don't care about the money. I don't care about the fame. I'm going to rebuild this the way it was meant to be." The room fell silent. The investors stared at him in disbelief. Richard's face reddened with anger. Josh looked almost shocked, but Ethan didn't care. He had spent too long allowing others to control his life, his dream, his future. It was time to take it back. Ethan walked out of that meeting with nothing but the app in his hands and his passion in his heart. He didn't have the investors' money anymore, the backing, the powerful connections. But what he did have was something no one could take away: his purpose. Over the next few months, Ethan began the process of rebuilding, this time from the ground up on his own terms. He rebranded the app, keeping it true to its original mission, focusing on helping people like him, those who had been pushed aside by the system. He reached out to the people who had supported him when he was just a dreamer. When he had nothing, he asked for their help, and together they built something new, something pure. Slowly but surely, the app began to grow again. Not as quickly as before, but with a loyal following of people who believed in what Ethan was doing. His vision was no longer clouded by the demands of investors or the pressure of success. It was his again. And as Ethan watched his app flourish, he realized something profound. True power wasn't about how high you climbed, how many people followed you, or how much money you made. True power came from being true to yourself, from staying grounded in your values, from knowing that the fight wasn't for fame or fortune, but for something bigger. Ethan had lost everything. But in doing so, he had gained everything he truly needed. The question remained, was it worth it? Was it worth the pain, the betrayal, the sacrifices? And as he looked out at the horizon, watching his vision take flight once again, Ethan knew that the answer would always be the same. It wasn't about winning. It was about becoming the person he was always meant to be. Ethan's journey proves that sometimes the most powerful rise isn't one that leads to fame and fortune. It's the one that leads to the truth, to finding who you are and never losing sight of it, no matter how many times you're knocked down. What's your rise going to look like? Will you fight to be the person you're meant to be, no matter the cost?